For 8 years, Elena Marsh told herself she had made peace with it. Her daughter would never hear a word she said, never hear music, never hear laughter. The best specialists in the country had confirmed it. And Elena, one of the most powerful women in American business, had learned to grieve quietly so her daughter would never see her fall apart. Then a 37-year-old security guard noticed something every doctor, every specialist, every expert had missed. Within 60 seconds, everything Elena believed about her daughter's life was wrong. And within 60 seconds after that, this quiet, unremarkable man had become the most dangerous variable in Elena Marsh's perfectly controlled world. Let's go back to where it all started. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor of Marsh Global Tower at 7:14 on a Thursday evening, and Ryan Cole stepped out carrying a paper cup of bad coffee and a radio he hadn't needed to use once in 4 hours. Temporary security work paid $16 an hour. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't close to what he used to do. But it covered Noah's school lunches and the busted water heater he'd been ignoring since February, and that was reason enough to put on the navy jacket with the embroidered patch that said Anchor Point Security and stand near a door for 6 hours without complaining. The charity gala on 42 was the kind of event Ryan Cole had zero business being inside. Marsh Global's annual fundraiser for children's medical research. $800 a plate, a string quartet in the corner, more wealth in one room than he'd ever seen in his life. He'd been assigned to the East Corridor, which mostly meant standing near a fire exit and redirecting the occasional lost caterer. He was fine with that. At 7:19 he noticed the little girl. She was sitting on the floor behind a large potted plant near the corridor junction, half hidden from the main room. 8 years old, maybe. Dark hair pulled into a braid that had mostly come undone. Her dress probably cost more than his rent, deep blue, small pearl buttons. She was holding both knees to her chest, rocking slightly, her face tight with something that wasn't quite crying but wasn't far from it. Ryan stood still a moment, just watching. The gala hummed 20 feet away. No one had noticed her. Catering staff moved past the corridor without looking. 2 guests in formal wear walked by without breaking their conversation. Ryan walked over. He crouched about 3 feet from the girl, keeping his distance, making himself smaller. He'd learned that from Noah. Kids don't like it when adults loom. "Hey," he said quietly. "You doing okay down there?" She didn't respond. Didn't look up. Kept rocking. He tried again, a little louder. Nothing. He tilted his head, looked more carefully. Her eyes were open and tracking. She wasn't zoned out, wasn't having some kind of episode. She simply wasn't hearing him. But it wasn't the silence of a child deliberately ignoring someone, it was different. She genuinely didn't know he was there until he shifted and his shadow crossed her line of sight. Then she flinched hard, scrambling back into the wall, and for one terrible second her face was pure animal fear. Ryan raised both hands, palms open. "Hey. Hey. I'm not going to hurt you. I work here." He pointed to the patch on his shoulder. "See? Security. I'm one of the safe ones." She stared at him, breathing fast and shallow, reading his face, his hands, his posture. Smart kid. Doing her own assessment. Slowly the terror dialed back. Not all the way, but enough. Ryan didn't move closer. He just stayed crouched, hands visible, letting her look at him as long as she needed, and that was when he saw it. He almost missed it. The corridor light was warm but indirect, and her hair covered most of her left ear. But when she tilted her head to get a better angle on his face, the braid shifted, and Ryan Cole saw something that made his whole body go still. There was something in her ear canal. Not obvious. Not large. But the angle was right, the light caught it for a second, and Ryan had spent enough time around classified bone conduction communications gear. In conditions where a misaligned component could cost a man his life, that his brain pattern matched before his conscious mind caught up. Metallic, small, and giving off a faint, almost imperceptible flicker, more like a dying battery than anything else. It had electronics inside it. He went very calm, the way he'd learned to go calm when a situation demanded it. Not detached, focused. "Okay," he said quietly, still not moving. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to just nod or shake your head." "All right." She watched his mouth and nodded. Good lip reading. She'd learned to lip read. "Does your ear hurt right now?" "This one?" He pointed carefully to his own left ear. She stared at him a long moment, then slowly raised her hand and touched the side of her own head, not quite pointing, more like acknowledging something she'd never been asked about before. A small uncertain shrug, which meant yes, or sometimes, or I don't know how to explain it. Any of those was enough. Ryan heard footsteps behind him before he heard the voice. "What is going on here?" It wasn't a question. It was the kind of sentence that came from a woman who'd spent a decade learning to make statements sound like commands, because commands were occasionally ignored and statements rarely were. Ryan stood and turned, and for the second time in 3 minutes he was struck by something unexpected. Elena Marsh was 30 years old and looked like she'd been awake for 48 hours and was furious about it. Her gown was elegant, her posture perfect, and there was a streak of mascara just below her left eye that she'd either not noticed or decided was no one's business. Behind her stood 2 bodyguards with the exact expression of men about to remove him from the building. She was sitting alone, Ryan said simply. She seemed frightened. "She's fine." Elena moved past him toward the girl, dropping to one knee. "Mia, baby, what are you doing out here?" The girl Mia turned toward her mother with the careful, deliberate movement of someone locating a sound source they could only half detect. Her face opened up immediately. She reached for Elena's arms. Elena pulled her in, held her a moment, then looked back at Ryan with an expression that wasn't quite hostile but was definitely an invitation to return to whatever door he'd come from. "Thank you for your concern," she said. "We're fine." Ryan should have nodded and walked away. He hesitated. Elena noticed. "Is there something else?" He looked at Mia, tucked into her mother's side, watching him with careful, serious eyes. "Her left ear," Ryan said. "Has she been examined recently? In the last few months?" Elena's expression shifted. "Excuse me? I'm not trying to overstep." He kept his voice level. "But I noticed something. It might be nothing. My daughter is profoundly deaf. She has been examined by 12 specialists over 6 years. Her voice was almost steady. Since she was 2. And she's had how many examinations? 12. 13. I stopped counting. An ENT physician who'd been pulled from the party Dr. Ellery looked up from the penlight in his hand. "I want to say something, and I need you to understand I'm not being critical of your daughter's previous physicians, because I genuinely cannot explain how this was missed. But something was missed." Mia sat in one of the conference room chairs, watching all 3 adults with the practiced attention of a child who'd learned that reading faces was sometimes the only way to understand a room. One hand was folded in her lap. The other was pressed flat against the conference table. Ryan noticed she'd been doing that since they walked in, feeling for vibrations. She'd learned to feel the world she couldn't hear. He crouched beside her chair. "Hey," he said, making sure she could see his face. "You okay?" She looked at him, then at her hand on the table, then back at him. She pointed to his hand, then to the table. He pressed his palm flat on the surface. She did the same. He tapped 3 times, slow and steady. 1, 2, 3. Her eyes widened. She tapped back. 1, 2, 3. Something happened in Ryan's chest that he hadn't expected. He pushed it aside and focused. "That's a smart thing you figured out," he said, feeling it instead of hearing it. "That was all you." She didn't understand every word, he could see that. But she caught enough to answer with the smallest, most cautious attempt at a smile he'd ever seen on a kid's face, like she was testing whether smiling was allowed. Behind him, Elena was on the phone, calling a car to take Mia to the medical facility she kept on permanent retainer. Her voice was controlled, professional, and utterly terrifying in its steadiness, because Ryan had enough experience with people under extreme stress to know that kind of control didn't come free. She was holding herself together by sheer force of habit. Diego, her security director, appeared in the doorway. "Car's downstairs. Dr. Ellery, can we get you in a separate vehicle?" "Of course." The room moved with the organized purpose that rooms take on when very wealthy people decide something needs to happen immediately. Ryan stepped back to give them space. He was halfway to the door when Mia grabbed his sleeve. He looked down. She was looking up at him with an expression he'd seen on exactly one other face in his life, his son Noah's, 2 years earlier, on the night Ryan came home from a very bad week, and Noah had somehow known, without being told, that his father needed someone who wouldn't let go. Ryan looked at Elena. She was watching. "I can find my own way out," he said. "Are you riding with us or not?" She caught herself. That wasn't. She stopped, looked at Mia's hand still holding his sleeve. "I don't want to intrude on your family, Mr. Cole." Elena picked up her bag, her patience for diplomatic language entirely spent. "My daughter does not hold on to people. She holds on to me, and she holds on to her stuffed elephant. For 4 years, those have been the only 2 items on that list. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and then I'm going to stop asking and simply tell you. Are you coming with us?" Ryan looked at Mia. She looked back, steady and serious and 8 years old. "Yeah," he said. "I'm coming." The procedure took 4 hours, and what they pulled from Mia's left ear canal was smaller than Ryan expected, barely the size of a pencil eraser, but dense with an internal architecture the imaging team initially mistook for a naturally occurring calcification, until a biomedical engineer called in from home at 11:30 at night took one look at the scan and sat down heavily in her chair. "That's manufactured," she said. "I know," Ryan said. She looked at him sideways. "And you're the security guard." She opened her mouth, closed it, and went back to the scan. The device was removed with the kind of precision that required 2 physicians, a microsurgical team, and 40 minutes of absolute silence in the operating suite. Ryan waited in the corridor with Diego, who had stopped looking at him like a potential threat somewhere around hour 2 and started making quiet conversation that, by hour 3, felt almost like the beginning of something that might become normal. At 12:47 in the morning, a nurse came out and said they were done. At 12:49, Ryan heard something, not dramatic, not cinematic, just a sound you might miss if you weren't paying attention. A small, uncertain, slightly panicked exhale from inside the recovery room, followed by a child's voice saying something he couldn't make out through the door. Then Elena's voice, higher than it had been all night, saying a single word back. Then silence. Then, soft and bewildered, like someone hearing rain for the first time in their life, the sound of a little girl crying. Ryan leaned against the corridor wall, looked at the ceiling, and pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose until the pressure behind his eyes eased. Diego cleared his throat once and looked at the opposite wall. Neither of them said anything. There wasn't anything to say. 40 minutes later, Elena came out of the recovery room. Her eyes were red, her mascara genuinely gone, and she was holding a cup of hospital vending machine coffee she hadn't touched, because she was Elena Marsh, and vending machine coffee was probably the most aggressively normal object she'd held in years. She stopped in front of Ryan. She heard the nurse's voice, Elena said. In recovery, before she was fully awake. She heard the nurse's voice, and she stopped, started again. Her audiologist is going to need to do a full assessment. Dr. Ellery says the interference the device was generating may have been suppressing residual auditory function for years. He doesn't know yet how much she'll another stop. He doesn't know. No, Ryan said. He won't know for a while. Elena looked at the coffee in her hands. Why were you working as a security guard? Not accusing, just asking, the way a person asks a question they've been turning over for hours and finally decide isn't going away. I told you. It pays the bills. Don't do that. She looked at him. Don't give me the easy answer. You knew what that device was. You recognized it. You kept a frightened 8-year-old calm using techniques that aren't in any childcare book I've ever read. You talked Diego out of throwing you out of a conference room, which, for reference, has never happened, because Diego used to work for the Secret Service. She finally looked up. So I'll ask again. Who are you? Ryan was quiet a moment. Someone who used to do something else, he said finally. And who has a 7-year-old son at home who thinks I'm currently working security and doesn't know I once did considerably more complicated things than that. Elena studied him. Why did you stop? He looked at the recovery room door. Because my son needed someone to be home, he said, and I was the only option. Elena didn't say anything for a long time. Then she looked down at the hospital coffee and, very deliberately, took a sip. She winced. She took another sip anyway. Her name is Mia, she said, like she was introducing them, like the last 6 hours hadn't happened and they were starting from somewhere more normal. She's 8. She loves elephants and cheese crackers, and she draws pictures of fish even though she's never been to the ocean. I know, Ryan said. She showed me one. She had it folded in her pocket. Elena looked at him. She doesn't show people those. She stopped again, and this time it wasn't composure, it was that she genuinely didn't know what to do with the information. Ryan didn't try to answer. Some things didn't need a response. They just needed to be left alone to settle, to find their own weight. Down the corridor, a monitor beeped softly, steady and regular, and in a recovery room with pale green walls, an 8-year-old girl was sleeping for the first time in her life in a world that had, without warning, become incomprehensibly loud. The audiologist's name was Dr. Priya Sanwal, and she had worked with Mia for 4 years without once questioning her own diagnosis. That wasn't arrogance, it was the natural consequence of evidence. Every test she'd run, every image she'd reviewed, every threshold measurement had returned the same result: profound sensory neural hearing loss, bilateral, no measurable response in the frequencies that mattered most for speech. She had staked her professional reputation on that certainty across 3 separate medical opinions delivered to Elena Marsh over 4 years of follow-ups. On the morning after the surgery, she sat across from an imaging report and a 3mm metallic capsule sealed in a specimen container, and she was not certain of anything. I need you to understand, she said carefully, this device would not have been visible on a standard exam. It was positioned beyond the second bend of the ear canal, a location that requires specialized imaging, or a reason to specifically suspect a foreign body. No one would have thought to look. Elena sat across from her, both hands flat on the table, and said nothing. I'm not making excuses, Dr. Sanwal added. I know you're not, Elena said. Keep going. The device appears to have generated a continuous low-frequency vibration, inaudible, but measurable in the 80 to 120 Hz range. Our working theory is that it created a kind of jamming effect. The cochlear pathways in Mia's left ear were being perpetually overstimulated by a signal that disrupted normal auditory processing. Over time, her brain learned to discard the input entirely. It's a known phenomenon in certain kinds of tinnitus, the brain actively suppresses a persistent unwanted signal. In Mia's case, the suppression became so complete it presented identically to nerve deafness. So she was never fully deaf. No. Dr. Sanwal said it quietly. We believe she retained significant residual hearing, possibly in the moderate range, that was masked completely for most of her life. Elena looked at the specimen container a long time. The device inside it was tiny and dull, its battery exhausted sometime the previous night. It looked like something you'd find in a broken wristwatch. It was 6 years of her daughter's life. Where did it come from? That question isn't in my lane, Dr. Sanwal said carefully. I can tell you what it did. I can't tell you who put it there. That answer satisfied Elena for about 48 hours. Then she hired a private investigation firm. What they found 3 weeks later arrived in a sealed folder, delivered by courier to Elena's personal office. She read it alone with the door locked, and when she finished, she sat completely still for 11 minutes. She knew, because she was watching the clock, using the numbers to hold herself together before she picked up the phone. The former nanny's name was Renee Foster. She'd worked for the Marsh household 7 months, starting when Mia was 14 months old, and left abruptly, officially, a family emergency, when Mia was 22 months. 2 months after Renee left, Mia was taken to her first pediatric audiologist for what Elena had assumed was a simple developmental delay in language. They sat in the hallway another 10 minutes. Then Mia picked up the metronome from the floor, examined it, and stood up. She walked to the therapy room door, looked back at Ryan. He stood up and followed her in. Elena stayed in the hallway a moment alone, pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, breathed, straightened, smoothed her jacket, and went in after them. The board meeting happened on the 42nd day after Mia's surgery, and it was, by Elena's own estimation, one of the worst of her professional career, not because of what the board said, but because of what she had to do. She had presented a proposal to allocate $12 million from the Marsh Global Philanthropic Fund toward a dedicated pediatric auditory research initiative, structured around the treatment approach Ryan had developed with Dr. Sanwal. Financially, it wasn't a huge ask. The fund distributed $38 million annually, and $12 million was a reallocation, not an addition. But the specific application was unusual, and several board members had done their homework. You're proposing to build a clinical program around a methodology developed by a man who, until 8 weeks ago, was working temporary security for $14 an hour, said the board member seated 4 chairs down. Walter Grimshaw, on the Marsh Global Board for 11 years, with, in Elena's private estimation, the people skills of a parking meter. I think the board would be forgiven for asking whether this is a sound strategic allocation, or whether this is a personal decision made under emotional circumstances. The room was quiet. Elena looked at Grimshaw. Both things can be true. The decision has an emotional origin. It also has a sound strategic basis, which you've had 2 weeks to review, and which Dr. Sanwal's letter of clinical endorsement addresses in considerable detail. If you'd like to argue the clinical merit, I'm ready to have that conversation. If you'd like to argue that my daughter's experience disqualifies me from making decisions, I'd like to hear you say that more plainly. Grimshaw opened his mouth. More plainly, Elena repeated. He closed it. She looked around the table. Mr. Cole has experience in applied acoustic signal processing, trauma response under extreme physical conditions, and as Mia's progress over the past 6 weeks demonstrates an evidently exceptional instinct for working with children in sensory recovery. The fact that he's been working temporary jobs while raising his son alone isn't a data point about his qualifications. It's a data point about the gap between what someone is worth and what the market happened to offer them at a particular moment. She picked up her pen. Are we voting on the proposal or not? They voted. It passed 9-3. Elena drove home that evening and found Ryan's truck parked outside, which meant he and Noah were upstairs with Mia and Mrs. Du Bois, the housekeeper, who had started leaving extra snacks on the kitchen counter Wednesdays and Saturdays, specifically because a certain 7-year-old had discovered her shortbread, and the household had adjusted accordingly. She took the elevator up and stood in the entryway a moment before anyone heard her come in. From the living room, Noah's voice, narrating something at high speed with the unself-conscious confidence of a kid explaining an important topic. The occasional percussion of the small drum. And then, underneath it, quiet and uncertain but there, the sound of Mia attempting to match a tone with her own voice, a small, effortful, entirely imperfect sound. Elena set her bag down and walked to the living room doorway. Mia was on the floor with Gus in her lap, Noah beside her, Ryan across from them with the drum. Mia was watching Ryan's face, trying to reproduce a sound he'd just made. She wasn't getting it yet. She tried again. Noah tried it too, badly on purpose, a deliberately ridiculous version that made Mia turn and look at him with an expression of pure 7-year-old collaborative conspiracy. She tried again, still not quite right, but different, incrementally closer. Elena leaned against the doorframe. Ryan glanced up and saw her. He didn't say anything, just looked at her a moment, taking in whatever was in her face, then looked back at Mia and nodded, encouraging her to try again. The board's discomfort with Ryan's appointment, which Grimshaw had made a point of registering formally in the meeting minutes, didn't go away after the vote.
It went quiet, which in Elena's experience was more operationally dangerous.
It resurfaced 6 weeks into the program's launch, in a way that was technically legal and professionally within the board's purview and calculated to be exactly both. Grimshaw brought a request for an independent external audit of the Foundation's program structure and a formal review of Ryan's professional qualifications, framed neutrally as standard governance procedure, filed 3 days before the meeting so Elena would have minimum preparation time.
She walked into that meeting knowing exactly what it was.
She sat at the head of the table, set her folder down, and looked at Grimshaw with the expression she reserved for situations where being civil was no longer the efficient choice. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to make sure everyone understands what we're about to spend the next hour discussing."
She opened the folder.
In the 6 weeks since the program launched, we've enrolled 14 children in the pilot cohort. 11 of those children had no prior treatment options through existing medical channels.
Their families were told by credentialed specialists that meaningful hearing recovery wasn't achievable. In 6 weeks, 9 of those 11 have shown measurable acoustic mapping progress. She looked up.
3 of those 9 are children whose families have been waiting for this result longer than Mia did. So when you bring an external audit request designed to slow or disrupt the program, I want you to understand precisely what you're proposing to slow. Grimshaw kept his expression neutral. The board has a fiduciary responsibility.
I know what the board's fiduciary responsibility is. I've been managing it for 5 years.
The audit request as filed has no procedural basis.
We've had no complaints, no compliance issues, no financial irregularities.
It's a qualification challenge dressed in governance language, and everyone at this table knows it.
She looked around the room.
If the board has specific concerns about Mr. Cole's qualifications, I invite those concerns to be stated plainly. I've asked him to be available by phone this morning, in case specific questions arise. Sandra Whitfield, 3 seats from Grimshaw, who had voted yes on the program, looked up.
You want him on the phone during a board meeting?
I want the people asking questions about him to have the opportunity to ask those questions directly, Elena said, rather than through a governance mechanism he can't respond to. The room was quiet a moment. That's highly irregular, Grimshaw said.
Yes, Elena agreed. It is. She picked up her phone. Should I call him? She called him. Ryan answered on the second ring, which meant he was already waiting.
She'd told him the night before it might happen, but hadn't been certain, and she registered again the way he handled uncertainty, not by filling it with words but by staying available. She put the phone on speaker. Mr. Cole, Grimshaw began, the board's concern is straightforward. The director role for a clinical program of this scope typically requires advanced medical or audiology credentials. Your background is military. Can you explain to the board why you believe your experience qualifies you for this position? A brief pause from the speaker.
Sure, Ryan said.
My last operational posting was team leader of a 6-person naval special warfare unit conducting rescue and recovery operations in high-noise environments. Part of my qualification for that role involved 8 months of intensive training in bone conduction communication systems and acoustic signal management.
How to transmit and receive meaningful information through physical vibration when conventional auditory channels are compromised.
I also spent 2 years as primary caregiver for a person with acquired auditory processing disorder, during which I independently studied the current clinical literature on cortical. Weeks blurred into a quiet stretch. The winter holidays came. On a phone call one evening, once the small talk ran out, there was a pause that wasn't uncomfortable. Which Ryan noticed, because uncomfortable silences had been his baseline for most of his adult life, and the fact that this one wasn't said something he wasn't ready to say out loud.
How's the holiday been? Elena asked.
Her voice had dropped into the register it used when the professional framing was off and she was just talking.
Quiet, he said. Good quiet. Noah beat me at checkers. Was he smug about it? Diplomatic? Which is somehow worse. She laughed.
A real one, not the polished social version, the short unguarded kind that slips out before you can manage it.
Mia's been drawing constantly. She drew the resonance board again, and then she drew you sitting across from it. He didn't respond right away. She got the posture right, Elena added. The way you sit cross-legged with your elbows on your knees. She's observant. She's been observant her whole life. She had to be. A pause. She drew me next to you in the picture. A shorter pause. Standing beside, not behind. She was very deliberate about the placement. Ryan looked at the checkerboard on his kitchen table. Elena. I'm not making it into anything, she said. I'm just telling you what she drew. Okay. Okay, she said. They stayed on the phone another 20 minutes, talking about nothing important. When they hung up, Ryan sat in his kitchen in the particular stillness of a house where a child is asleep and everything is quiet and there's finally space to think about things daylight hours don't have room for. He thought about them a while, then went to bed. January arrived the way January does, gray and declarative, making no apologies for the fact that December was over. The program reopened the second week, and the expanded cohort Dr. Sanwal had proposed was approved. 6 new children, ages 5 through 11, varying degrees of residual auditory function, all referred through the network of pediatric audiologists Elena had quietly been cultivating since October. Ryan sat in on the intake assessments for each new child, not technically part of his role, but Dr. Sanwal had stopped questioning it, because his read on a child's readiness was consistently more accurate than the standard battery. He didn't interfere with her clinical process. He sat off to the side and watched. There was a 5-year-old named Miles who shut down completely at the sight of audiometry equipment, having had too many unpleasant experiences with it, and who did not shut down when Ryan slid the resonance board across the table without explanation and let him touch it. There was a 9-year-old named Grace who communicated primarily through written notes she prepared in advance, handed to adults with the formality of a small person who decided that if the world was going to be difficult about her hearing, she was going to be organized about it. There was an 11-year-old named Malik, furious in the specific way of older kids who'd spent years watching younger children get more patience from adults, and who responded to Ryan addressing him without simplification or apology with the particular suspicion of someone waiting for the catch. There was no catch. Ryan just talked to him like a person and let him be as difficult as he needed to be. You're not going to tell me it gets easier, Malik said during their second session, the question out before he could stop it, immediately looking like he regretted asking. Ryan thought about whether to be honest or reassuring, and chose honest. Some of it gets easier. Some of it just gets different. But you build more tools, and the tools start to feel like yours instead of things other people made you carry. Malik looked at the resonance board. What if I don't want more tools? What if I just want it to work? Yeah, Ryan said. That's fair. He didn't offer anything else, because there wasn't anything else that was true. They sat in silence a minute. Then Malik pressed his palm against the resonance board, didn't ask, just did it. Ryan started the tone sequence without making anything of it. Mia's first real word, not a vocalization, an approximation, but a word, happened on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of January, at 3:17, without warning or ceremony or any preparation that might have let the people in the room brace for it. They'd been working 45 minutes on what Sanwal called acoustic anchoring, Ryan producing a clear, consistent sound while Mia tracked it with both the resonance board and her own voice, building the neural connection between acoustic input and vocal output that had to precede meaningful speech. It was painstaking work. Some days it produced visible progress. Some days it produced nothing but fatigue, and Mia would end the session with her chin tucked and her hands in her lap, the expression of someone who'd worked very hard at something that hadn't moved. That day she'd been at the edge of the fatigue threshold for 10 minutes. Ryan could see it. Sanwal could see it. They were approaching the natural end of the session, about to start winding down, when Mia did something she hadn't done before. She put both hands against her own throat. Not self-consciously, not as an exercise, just hands against throat, feeling for her own vibration the way he'd taught her to feel for it in the board. She'd taught herself to transfer the principle. He went still. She pressed her lips together. He could see her doing internally what she always did in sessions, organizing, preparing,
choosing, except faster than usual, more urgent, like something had risen close enough to the surface that it was either coming out now or not at all. Dr. Sanwell's pen stopped. Mia pushed air from her diaphragm, he could see it in her posture, the small gathering of effort, and opened her mouth. The first attempt produced no sound, just breath. She tried again. This time, something came. Thin, effortful, the consonant and vowel pressing unevenly against each other, the whole thing lasting less than half a second. But it was shaped. It was aimed at something. She looked directly at the observation window, at her mother. She tried again. Clearer this time. 2 distinct syllables, imperfect, the vowel slightly off, but unmistakably organized around a real word, the word she'd chosen out of everything for this moment. Not the easiest word, not the most practiced. The one that mattered. Mom. It was barely above a whisper. Shaped wrong at the edges, the M held too long, the vowel sliding downward in a way no one who'd spoken their whole life would produce. It was the most complete sound in the room. Behind the glass, Elena Marsh made a sound of her own, involuntary, strangled, something breaking that had been held together by sheer structural will for a very long time. She pressed both hands against the glass, not reaching, not able to reach, just needing contact with the surface that separated her from her daughter. In the therapy room, Ryan didn't move. Didn't speak. He looked at Mia. She was watching him, waiting not for approval. She'd moved past needing his approval to tell her whether she'd done something real. She was watching to see what it meant that she'd done it, how he understood it. He nodded, just once, slow and definite. She exhaled. The tension in her shoulders dropped 2 full inches. Behind the glass, Elena was on her knees. Ryan couldn't see her, but Dr. Sanwell could, from her seat angle, and he saw it in Sanwell's face. The clinician who'd spent 4 years certain of what Mia could not do, now sitting 3 feet from evidence of everything she'd missed. She wasn't crying. She was doing the thing clinicians train themselves to do when they're about to cry, sitting very still, breathing evenly, keeping the professional exterior in place through the specific controlled effort of someone who understands the moment isn't about them. Mia in the therapy room looked at her hands on her throat, then pressed the resonance board with one palm, then her throat again, mapping it, connecting the vibration in the board to the vibration she'd just produced in herself, filing it, understanding they were the same principle at different scales. She'd built that connection herself, in real time. Ryan stayed on the floor until she was done mapping, then reached into his bag and pulled out the drum. He tapped once. She tapped back. He tapped twice. She tapped back. Then she put her hands on her throat and made the sound again, clearer. "Mom," she said, and looked at the observation window. Elena didn't come into the room right away. She needed 3 minutes in the corridor first, spent with her back against the wall and her hands over her face, doing nothing organized or controlled or otherwise appropriate. She cried the way people cry when they've held something so long that when it finally lets go, the whole body is involved, not elegant, not quiet, full of the specific gracelessness of real grief releasing. Diego, her security director, who'd been with her 4 years and seen her through things most people never see anyone through, stood at the end of the corridor and didn't approach and didn't look away, because he'd learned what she needed in those moments was simply someone present who wasn't going to make her perform composure before she had it back. After 3 minutes, she straightened, pressed her fingertips under her eyes, breathed, walked to the door, and opened it. Mia turned, just a moment. Neither of them moved. Then Mia crossed the room in 4 steps and put her arms around her mother's waist, the way she always had, the way she'd done her whole life, the physical language that had been their primary vocabulary since before Mia had any other kind. Elena held her daughter and said nothing, because there was nothing that would be equal to the moment, and she was finally wise enough to know it. Mia pulled back after a minute, looked up at her mother's face, raised one hand, touched her own throat, and said it again. "Mom." Elena made a sound that wasn't a word. She pulled Mia back in and held her, pressed her cheek to the top of her daughter's head, and stayed there. Across the room, Dr. Sanwell was writing in her notebook with the focus of someone who needed her hands doing something specific. Ryan sat on the floor with the drum in his lap, looking at the city through the window, and his face was the face of a man who had carried something a long way and had just, without fanfare, been allowed to set it down. The media found out 6 weeks later. Not through Elena, she'd been careful, more careful than the situation probably required, because she'd learned early that visibility cut both directions. But one of the other families in the pilot cohort spoke to a journalist, off the record and then on the record, and the journalist was good at the job and pulled the thread until it unraveled into a story that ran in a Sunday health supplement under the headline, "The Girl Who Heard Her Mother's Voice." Elena read the headline on her phone at 6 in the morning and called her PR director before 7.
"How bad?"
"It's not bad," her director said.
"That's the thing. The piece is good. Sympathetic, solid clinical framing. The family they interviewed said everything right. The problem isn't the article." "Then what's the problem?" "It's already been picked up by 4 national outlets and it's trending." A pause. "People want to know about the security guard." Elena was quiet. "The headline in the second pickup," her director said carefully, "is Billionaire's daughter cured by security guard." Which isn't accurate on multiple levels, but it's going to be hard to walk back once it's the frame. "Ryan's not going to want." "I know. But his name's in the original piece. It's already out there." She hung up and called Ryan. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd already seen it. "I didn't give them anything," he said immediately. "I know. I'm not calling about that." A pause. "How are you?" Noah's school called. His teacher saw the article, wanted to make sure he was okay. "Is he?" "He's fine." Didn't know his dad was in the news until his teacher told him. Another beat. He thought it was pretty cool. "Are you okay?" A longer pause. "I don't love it. Not the security guard framing, I don't care about that. But it makes it sound like I did one miraculous, singular thing, and what I actually did was notice one thing and then show up consistently for the next 4 months. Those aren't the same story. I know the kids in the program, all 14 of them. Their progress isn't because of me. It's the methodology, and Sanwall, and the fact that they worked incredibly hard in situations that were genuinely frightening. That's the story. Not whatever the headline is." "You want to talk to the journalist?" "No. Immediate. I don't want to talk to anyone." A pause. "But if we don't say something, the frame stays." "I'll handle it," Elena said. "I'll do a statement through the foundation that centers the clinical team and the families. Your name stays in it, it has to, it's accurate, but the frame shifts." "You don't have to do anything, Ryan. This is what I do." She said it without impatience, plainly. "Let me do it." He was quiet a moment. "Okay. The board's going to use this," she said. "Grimshaw, specifically. The visibility changes the calculus." "How?" "Because now it's harder to quietly dismantle something the public thinks is working, which is a double-edged problem. We get protection from the visibility, but we also get scrutiny. And scrutiny means everyone looks harder at the parts that aren't finished yet." A pause. "I want you to know that before it happens." "It was already going to happen," he said. "Programs like this get reviewed when they're working. That's not a threat, it's just how institutions operate." "You're very calm about this." "I've been in situations where being calm was the only available option long enough that it became a habit." A pause. "Also, Noah's currently eating cereal and explaining why anglerfish would make good pets, and it's hard to catastrophize about media coverage and maintain that conversation at the same time." Elena stood at her kitchen window, the city doing what it always did. Moving, indifferent, enormous, full of people with no idea what had happened that afternoon in a small therapy room, where a girl had pressed her hands to her throat and said a word for the first time. "He'd want a saltwater tank," she said. "He already priced one out. 42 gallons. Showed me the website." "Mia would draw the fish," Ryan said. "She would absolutely draw the fish." There was a brief silence that wasn't about any of the things they just discussed. I'll have the statement ready by noon, Elena said. Okay. Thank you. She hung up and opened a new document. Later that evening, Ryan had been on his way out when he heard her. He stopped in the doorway. Mia didn't know he was there. She was talking to the fish, actually talking, low and unhurried, the words not clear enough yet to be understood across a room, but present, continuous. A girl in private conversation with 3 small fish in a tank on her dresser, doing the thing that had been taken from her before she was old enough to know it was being taken. Ryan stood in the doorway and didn't move for a long time. Then he walked quietly back to the kitchen, where Elena was on the phone with the foundation's operations director and Noah was eating cereal at the counter. He sat down on one of the stools. Noah looked at him. "She's talking to the fish," Noah said. "Yeah," Ryan said. "She's been in there a while." "Yeah." Noah ate a spoonful of cereal. "Is that good?" Ryan looked at his son, the 7-year-old person who had handed him tools in a garage, researched anglerfish, waved hello to a stranger's daughter, and absorbed an entirely new family configuration with the flexibility of someone for whom love wasn't a finite resource to be protected, but simply a thing that expanded to fit what was needed. "That's very good," Ryan said. Noah nodded, satisfied, and went back to his cereal. The legal case against Renee Foster and the man who'd operated as Dr. Aaron Kessler concluded in February, 2 weeks before Mia's birthday, with a civil settlement whose specific terms were sealed by mutual agreement. What wasn't sealed, because Elena's attorneys had been very deliberate about this, was the matter of public record confirming that a fraudulent medical practice had resulted in documented harm to a minor. That record existed independent of the financial resolution, and by the time the settlement was signed, it had already triggered a broader state medical board investigation into the network of unlicensed practitioners Kessler had been connected to. 3 other families came forward during that investigation. Their children had gone through different interventions with different outcomes, but the pattern was the same. A practitioner operating outside any legitimate framework, selling experimental procedures to families who'd run out of legitimate options and were desperate enough to take the risk. 2 of those children were now enrolled in the Foundation's expanded program. The third had moved out of state and been connected with a clinical partner the Foundation had trained earlier that year. Elena didn't attend the settlement signing. She sent her attorneys. She spent that morning sitting in on an assessment for a 4-year-old named Nora, diagnosed profoundly deaf at 18 months, who pressed her whole face against the resonance board on first contact, cheek and chin and forehead, maximizing surface area, instinctively doing what Mia had done in her very first session, without being shown how. Elena sat in the observation area and thought about the word instinct. About how it was often just the body doing what it needed before the mind had cleared enough space to decide, about how much of what looked like talent was actually a particular kind of desperation given the right conditions and enough time. She thought about a charity gala and a corridor and a man crouching with his palms open, making himself smaller so a frightened child wouldn't have to look up. She thought about what it cost to notice things. Not just to see them, which was passive, reflexive, the eyes doing what eyes do, but to actually notice, which meant bringing your full attention to something the situation hadn't flagged as important, that no one else in the room had caught, that you had no official obligation to pursue. Noticing was a choice. It was an act. And in her experience with the board members and executives and specialists who surrounded her professional life, it was considerably rarer than intelligence or credentials or confidence. She had built a company on the ability to identify that quality in other people and put them where it mattered. She had somehow missed it in herself, the way the skills most native to you are sometimes the hardest to see clearly, because they're indistinguishable from simply how you move through the world. I noticed the mascara on my own face in the hospital mirror the morning after the gala, she thought. I noticed the way Mia looked at Ryan in the corridor before I understood what it meant. I noticed 11 pages of handwritten notes and knew, before Sanwall confirmed it, that they were real. Maybe that was the thing. Maybe the thing that connected her and Ryan, from the beginning, in the corridor, in the 40 minutes when everything shifted, wasn't circumstance, or proximity, or the gravitational pull of shared crisis. Maybe it was simply that they were both people who noticed. And noticing, as a practice, as a mode of being, was lonely work until you found someone doing it beside you. She watched a 4-year-old press her face against a resonance board, feeling for vibrations in a world that hadn't yet found a way to reach her, and thought, we will reach her. That is what this is for. The Marsh Hearing Foundation's formal public launch happened on a Saturday in late April, in a mid-sized event venue 3 blocks from the foundation's offices, not the penthouse, not Marsh Global Tower, with high ceilings, good acoustics, and long tables for the families of every child currently enrolled. There were 41 children in the program by then. Not all of them in the city. 8 were remote participants, connected through partner clinicians trained in the methodology over a 3-week intensive Dr. Sanwal had designed and Ryan had co-taught. The waiting list had stopped being counted in hundreds and started being counted in the time it would take to reach each family at the current pace of expansion, the metric Ryan had taped to the wall above his office desk, where other directors hung mission statements. The venue filled slowly, the way events fill when the people attending aren't accustomed to events, families with children who navigated the world differently, who'd spent years calibrating the environments their kids could manage, who arrived with exit strategies already mapped, with the specific preparedness of people for whom the gap between what was promised and what was delivered had historically been large. They came in, looked around, looked at each other, and the quality in the room was something Elena felt in her own chest, hope that had been disappointed many times, walking through a door one more time anyway. She stood near the entrance for the first hour, greeting each family personally, not from a stage, not with a prepared welcome, just Elena, standing near the door, shaking hands, learning names, listening to the things parents said when given space to say them without a time limit. She was good at this, had always been good at the specific executive skill of making individual people feel genuinely seen in brief encounters. But this was different from the boardrooms and acquisition meetings where she developed the skill. This was different because what people told her mattered to her in a way that wasn't strategic, or professional, or subject to any calculation she'd been trained to make. A woman named Karen, who had driven 4 hours from upstate with her 6-year-old son, told her that before the program, she'd started to believe she was failing her child, not that the condition was hard, but that she, specifically, was failing him, because the resources available weren't working and she'd run out of things to try and didn't know how to explain to her son why she kept taking him to new rooms with new equipment and coming home with the same silence. Elena listened to all of it. She didn't say she understood, because the specific contours of another person's suffering weren't something you could claim to understand from the outside. She said, he's in the right place now, and meant it plainly, with no performance in it. Ryan was across the room, crouched down, talking to Malik. The 11-year-old who'd arrived furious in January and was now, 4 months later, still prickly, still difficult, and also measurably better in ways the assessments captured and ways they didn't. The ways harder to quantify, how he carried himself walking into the session room versus how he'd walked in that first day. Malik was talking with the intensity that was his baseline register, hands moving, making a point. Ryan was listening with the quality of attention that meant he was actually listening and not preparing his response, which is rarer in adults than it should be, and which Malik, like most kids who'd grown up managing adult impatience, recognized and responded to. Noah appeared at Ryan's elbow, handed him a cup of something, and got immediately drawn into the conversation with the adaptability of a kid who'd learned adult conversations were often more interesting than the adult-designated activities happening elsewhere in a room. Elena watched from across the space. She thought about how you couldn't plan for this. You could build the structure, fund the program, staff the clinical team, rent the venue, arrange the catering. But you couldn't plan for the quality of a particular man's attention in a room. The way it organized things. The way it made people feel the space was safe enough to be honest in. That wasn't a resource you could acquire. That was just who someone was. She'd learned, over the past 8 months, to resist the instinct to evaluate everything as a resource. The instinct that had made her effective, and the instinct that had made her lonely, and the instinct she was still, imperfectly, working on. Imperfectly. Not in progress, not developing, not on a growth trajectory. Just imperfectly, which was the only honest way to describe the actual texture of changing. Mia appeared at her side, wearing a dress she'd chosen herself. Blue, because she'd always worn blue, but a different shade than the one from the charity gala a year ago, deeper, more deliberate. Gus was in the crook of her arm, and she was scanning the room with the careful attention she brought to unfamiliar spaces. Elena put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Mia looked up. Okay? Elena said. Mia considered the room, then looked at her mother. Loud.
One word, clear enough to be understood without lip reading, without context, without anything but the word itself and a slight wrinkling of her nose that communicated her position on loudness.
Yes, Elena agreed. It is.
Mia looked back at the room, then pointed across it toward Ryan and Noah and Malik.
Go. Not a question, a statement, an intention. Go ahead, Elena said. She watched her daughter cross the room.
9 years old, upright, Gus under one arm, moving through the crowd with the careful purposefulness of someone who'd spent her whole life learning to read the world in ways most people never needed to, and who carried that knowledge now not as a wound but as a particular, hard-won kind of intelligence. She watched Noah spot Mia from 10 feet away and immediately moved to make room for her in the conversation without breaking stride, the way people do for family. She watched Ryan register Mia's approach without looking up, some peripheral awareness, some quality of attention that included the room even while he was focused inside it, and shift slightly to complete the circle. She stood across the space and watched her family on a Saturday afternoon in April, loud and imperfect and completely real. The formal program happened at 7, after the children had eaten and several of the youngest had fallen asleep on coats in a corner. Elena spoke first, briefly, from notes she'd written herself and then set aside, because the notes were the formal version and the formal version wasn't what the room needed.